Good evening. My name is Mike Narragon, and I serve on the board of the Mount Lebanon Historical Society. The Mount Lebanon Historical Society, in partnership with the library and the school district, have teamed to sponsor Pete DiNardo's 3 talks, and I celebrate this budding institutional partnership. So much so that I'm going to plug the Historical Society's next session. They're going to be sponsoring a talk on Thursday, April 12th at the library at 7 p.m., and it'll be covering the Homestead Strike. There are other information about the Historical Society on the table, and you can pick it up as you exit. I also have the distinct pleasure of counting Pete DiNardo as among my friends, a friendship that now spans decades. Introducing Pete recently got a lot easier. The Mount Lebanon magazine profiled Pete as the winner of the Community Service Award bestowed on him by the Community Relations Board. The article details the multiple ways in which Pete serves this community, and what truly emerges is a portrait of a gifted teacher and a caring person. That wasn't even my applause line. My applause line's later. Those of us who have gathered in this hall over the past few months know this portrait to be true based on our own experiences. When the lights dim tonight, Pete will have given more than 4 hours of spellbinding lecture and discussion, and I hope you will join me in thanking him. There we go. That was my applause line. Before beginning his talk on Martin Luther King, Pete asked me to synthesize his earlier talks in order to place tonight's discussion in some sort of context. There is a nice synergy, I would argue, between how Pete conducts his life, as profiled in the magazine, and the lectures he has given the community since February. Pete invited us to know Medgar Evers, a once towering figure of the civil rights movement, who has slipped into the deep recesses of our collective memories. Our contemporary culture and politics often can seem bereft of heroes, and Pete reminded us all that heroes can be found not only in the past, but also all around us, if we look close enough for those striving to make a positive difference in their communities. Pete's second talk challenged us to recognize the historical agency of women like Rosa Parks, and to consider the implications this historical exercise carries as we try to imagine a more equitable present. Looking deeper into the scope and importance of Rosa Parks' career as a lifelong activist on multiple fronts reminds us that deep change depends on sustained movements, and that those on the forefront of these movements often consider their work to be unfinished. To allow Parks, in Pete's memorable phrase, to get off the bus and to walk into the rest of her life, forces us to reimagine our relationship to the work she started and asks us to consider whether we have the gumption and the stamina to be everyday leaders, to take up that work ourselves. Both Evers and Parks took actions designed to provoke and stir others into dialogue, discussion, and debate. They sought to generate conflict and to create creative disturbances. I left this talk last month wondering about the implications of Pete's work for us, and I began to think about the relationship between the ways we respond to conflict in the present and our ability to reach out past our differences to build compassionate communities and to heal the social and economic fissures in our societies. While I do not profess to have all the answers, Pete's work contains some clues. He reminded us that progress depended on those who troubled the waters, as well as how folks responded to the conflict that followed. Rosa Parks kept her eyes focused on the central issues. When the police officer entered the bus to arrest her, Parks confronted him, asking him to consider his role in the larger system and to recognize the big ideas clashing over a seat on the bus. She asked the officer, "Why do you push us around? Not why are you arresting me, but why do you wield power in such an abusive manner?" And the officer's response was equally revealing. His answer, "I don't know, but the law is the law, and you're under arrest." I don't know. For just that brief moment, Parks' question forced the officer to confront his role in maintaining this system. Likewise, Pete calls on us to take the knowledge he gives us about the past and to consider its meaning for our own lives and where we stand in relation to the stories he tells. In short, plunging headfirst into history and the complicated stories it contains in Pete's capable hands opens up more than just fragments of new knowledge. Nestled within this exercise is a challenge, one that asks us not only to think differently about the past, but to look at our past and our present with different, more carefully attuned eyes. I cannot thank Pete enough for taking the time, energy, and care to lead us all on this intellectual journey. Tonight, Pete will conclude his trilogy with The Dreams of the Unknown King, an exploration of the message and ideals of Martin Luther King, and I welcome him to the podium.
Mike, thank you for that, I would say kind, but that would be an insult, a hyperbolic introduction. More so for 25 years of being the best friend that I could ask for. You're an inspiration, a scholar, and the very best teacher in this state. I am nervous. I'm nervous tonight because this is an imposing topic. This week, there has been tremendous research presented about Dr. King. The first two talks, I could feel comfortable. I thought I could feel comfortable thinking I knew more than you did. I'm not comfortable that I could think that or say that tonight. I've enjoyed exciting email exchanges with Tom O'Brien about this capacity and this idea. And I'm struggling to figure out how I will honor this great man. But in the sort of idea of Soren Kierkegaard, I stand at the abyss in fear and trembling, and I need to take that leap of faith. For me, it was November of 1987. I can't recall the exact date, but the basic spirit and the events that happened on that day are seared into my memory. It was my first year of teaching through the Jesuit Volunteer Corps in South Central Los Angeles. And I experienced my very first death of a student I taught. His name was Bernard. At the school that day, I had talked with Bernard. That night, Bernard died, murdered by a gang member who was upset that Bernard would not participate in criminal activity with him. My last conversation with Bernard was the result of seeing Bernard in the school parking lot, confronting a young man who was not a student at our school in heated exchange. I ran out to the parking lot to intervene. At that time in my life, through some cursory readings of a Christian anarchist, a French Jesuit, and Gene Sharp, I was a devoted follower of absolute pacifism. And I explained to Bernard after I separated the other young man and he left the grounds that we came from very different worlds and I couldn't understand his world, but I would like to try to get to know it. But the thing I wanted most was for him to be safe. Those are the very last words that I said to him. The next day, as I heard of his murder, I was angry, hurt, and broken. So I took my virtually brand new copy of A Testament of Hope, the essential writings of Dr. Martin Luther King, with me. And I found an isolated beach north of Los Angeles. And I read, seeking comfort, seeking inspiration, seeking direction. Since that time, Dr. King has given me all of that. But then I began to mature. My wife doubts that, but I began to mature. And I read deeply, and King began to challenge me, and he still does. So what I would ask is for a moment, if we would all pause in silence in memory of this great man and think about how Dr. King has influenced your life. History is as much about what we forget from the past as what we remember. Last month, as Mike noted, I asked you to let Rosa Parks off the bus. Tonight, I am going to ask you to be open to letting Martin Luther King off the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. We have a complex, paradoxical, and malformed understanding of Dr. King. First, we deify King, place him on a pedestal, something he never wanted. Second, as Cornel West said at a talk about 10 years ago that I brought students to, we sanctify King by defining him as a moderate and thus robbing him of his radicalism and robbing us of his message. Certain people today cherry pick from his message for their own present political purposes and express meanings of his that he did not hold. And third, as a nation, we struggle because we praise his nonviolence, and yet we advocate militant rights to gun ownership and have bases in have men in bases in 700 places around the world. For Claiborne Carson, the movement was, just as Ella Baker said, much larger than Dr. King. And thus, Carson was surprised when Coretta Scott King asked him to archive all the King papers. But Carson, far more intelligent, but like me, said in reading King's works, for me and for many of his youthful critics, King became wiser as we grew older, which we hope happens with all of our children, for us. That's a different story, though. At the start, I concede Martin Luther King was a flawed man. He had too active a sexual appetite. He perhaps, in a cultural context, borrowed ideas from others. He at times made tactical errors. We should recognize and acknowledge these flaws, but that is not the purpose tonight. I am here and more interested to talk about our flaws and failing to see the depth of a king that we do not know. So I want to focus on the diverse dreams of Dr. King. First, we'll look at the most well-known phase of his dream and his concept of change. Second, we go into the phase in which his dream, as he said, became a nightmare. Third, we'll look at the phase in which he went radical or recovered his radicalism and looked at moral, international, and economic justice. And then finally, I'd like to explore the possibility that Dr. King has relevance for us today. So let's examine his most known moment, the one in which he remains frozen in time. More than any other speech in American history, I Have a Dream is understandably an iconic memory and a hope and a potential. You can see in this rhetoric analysis, it is considered the #1 speech in American history. In 2008, a study of teenagers found that 97% of teenagers, 97% recognized King's words. But if we look at the title of the march, we see the broader depth of it. Jobs and freedom, voting rights, economic rights, end to police brutality. It was a much larger dream and vision than we recall. Many whites, including the president, and a few blacks were not certain about his march. Washington was tense. Outside the city, thousands of combat troops were ready to move in case of trouble. Many businesses were closed. The president's lawyers wrote up martial law orders in case of disturbances. The city stockpiled plasma, banned the sale of liquor, bullets. 2 Washington senators' games were canceled. After a long, hot day, Dr. King appeared as the final of 10 speakers. The speech King meant to give, prepared to give, was meant to be short. The first half, the one few of us remember, was a history lesson, a reference to Lincoln, and a retelling of a set of warnings. According to King's speechwriter Clarence Jones, on the night before the speech, a group of men met at the Willard Hotel and discussed amendments and changes to King's draft. They had many different desires and wants to get in the speech. After a few hours, King said to his allies, "My brothers, let me go and counsel with the Lord." And he went up to his room and spent the night writing in longhand. He was crossing out words 3 and 4 times. He finished the draft at 4 a.m., delivered it to a colleague who would have it typed up and sent to the press. The speech did not include the words, "I have a dream." If you ever watched the video of the speech, it's almost 18 minutes long. And the first 10 minutes, you see King look down regularly, look down regularly. He's reading the prepared draft. Starting at about 10 and a half minutes, he stops. Taylor Branch, the great King historian, describes the speech up to that point as an effective speech, but far from historic, and in places club-footed. Then King came to a sentence that he didn't feel quite comfortable with, and it was interesting because the sentence used this phrase, creative dissatisfaction. That phrase would come about in King's sermons and speeches often, but for some reason, he didn't like it at that moment. He skipped it and went to another part of the speech. And if you listen closely, he stumbles twice, something King doesn't do, unlike me. Then he paused again. And during one of those two pauses, Mahalia Jackson, who had sung before, is heard to have gone, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." King paused for a few seconds. The last 5.5 minutes of the speech, the one you remember, is totally ad-libbed. It was not written. Joan saw it all happening. Joan heard Mahalia Jackson, saw King slide his prepared text to the left, he said, and then turned to the gentleman next to him and said, "These people out there today don't know it, but they're about to go to church." And if you've listened to that last 5 minutes, you understand what he meant. But the actual fact is King had delivered that speech multiple times before. In Charlotte in 1960, he said, "In a real sense, America is essentially a dream yet unfulfilled. It is a dream of a land where men of all races, colors, and creeds will live together as brothers." In 1962, to bring into full realization the American dream, a dream of equality of opportunity widely distributed. In April of '63, he said he had a dream of seeing little Negro boys and girls walking up to school, playing in parks, swimming together with little white boys and girls. In June in Detroit, he said he dreamed that Negroes will be able to buy or rent a house anywhere that their money will carry them and that they will be able to get a job. But in this context, in this moment in front of 250,000 people, his biblical references came alive as hope. His promises to make freedom ring, and he painted that beautiful picture from New England to California and then became specific. And when freedom rings at Stone Mountain, Georgia, and Lookout Mountain, Tennessee, and if you're not aware, those are the birthplaces of the two clans. When freedom rings there, then we have arrived. And then he ends with that great spiritual, free at last, free at last. Coming after 340 years of bondage and servitude, it was a statement of hope and possibility. The audience paused for a second and then gave an uproar. John Kennedy turned to a friend as they were watching on television. He said, "He's damn good." Between 1960 and 65, King was the acknowledged leader of the civil rights movement. He was one of the 3 or 4 most influential men in the world. Time magazine named him their Man of the Year. In 1964, he understandably won the Nobel Peace Prize. For 5 years, he was the glue of the movement that held militant young blacks together with connections with establishment whites. Today, we adore this speech, and it still gives me goosebumps every time that I listen to it. It has his universal ideals throughout it, railing against the tribalism that is so prevalent today. It reveals his skills as a minister and his oratorical exceptional qualities, his appeal to white liberals, and his faith that white men and this nation would redeem ourselves. His willingness to compromise and blend demands with conservative values, particularly toward the black community also, and his ability to change and adapt and seize a moment, retreat or push at a proper time. At the time, though, deification was not universal. In 1963, most Americans disapproved of the event. A Gallup poll in 1963 found that 78% of white people would move out of their neighborhood if many blacks moved in. Many congressmen saw his speech as seditious. The FBI and local police elevated their investigation with the support of the Kennedys. J. Edgar Hoover described King as a demagogue and the most dangerous Negro to the nation from the standpoint of national security. Throughout that period, in 1961, while we celebrated the Freedom Rides 7 years ago, most people did not believe that they added positive value. 1966, demonstrations for civil rights do more harm than good. African Americans also questioned King. 71% of blacks in the Gallup poll said King was moving at the right speed. But 21% said, not fast enough. SNCC activist James Bevel called the march and the speech Nothing but a damn picnic on the Capitol lawn. Malcolm X referred to it as ridiculous and the farce on Washington. James Cone, a scholar of black liberation theology I enjoy reading, opens this book, Martin and Malcolm, with an interesting excerpt of King's speech juxtaposed with one from Malcolm that Malcolm gave a few months after. "I see America," said Malcolm, "through the eyes of a victim. I don't see an American dream. I see an American nightmare." So with all this division, how could King see so much hope for America? For the vast majority of his life, Martin Luther King retained, amazingly, a hopeful vision of humanity and a potential for change. He entered Morehouse College at the age of 15, graduated, then moved to Crozer Theological Seminary in 1948 at the age of 19. At Crozer, his mind grappled with many intellectual influences. Walter Rauschenbusch, the great advocate of Christian socialism and the social gospel, who advocated bringing the kingdom of God to earth. Reinhold Niebuhr, who challenged the false optimism of many liberal Protestants and shaped King's vision of sin and how it shapes social groups. King said at Crozier, reading Hegel helped him see that growth comes through struggle. Interesting, during these 6 years, he really didn't address the issue of race much. Most people believe that as the integrationist he was, his vision of sin and social justice led him to believe that the white society had decent souls that were led astray by social forces and misconceptions. Devotees of the American ideal and our system, especially those of us in the racial majority and elite educationally, socially, politically, and economically, lean towards believing that anyone can succeed in America if they will it to be so. We want the dream expressed by King in that 5 minutes to be real in theory and practice. In a 1949 essay at Crozier titled My Religious Development, King expressed a deep understanding that my gov peeps that are here will understand I call a pre-birth lottery of luck. Here's what he wrote. "I have never experienced the feeling of not having the basic necessities of life. I was exposed to the best educational conditions. It is quite easy for me to think of a God of love, mainly because I grew up in a family where love was central and ever present. It is quite easy for me to think of the universe as basically friendly, mainly because of my uplifting environmental circumstances." Now, King wrote, too, about racist attacks that he had when he was a child, and his conversation with his parents about it, and they shared their experiences, and he became despondent. He frankly and understandably, at that point in his life, wanted to hate white people. But his parents and his faith taught him something else. He struggled with that conflict for years. But what King is telling us and showing us is that he grasped both his fortune and the systemic limits that he faced. Our nation today would do well to apply this thinking. Though he was a tactical realist, his ability to touch our souls impresses me. King believed in and adhered to and spread the message of nonviolence and redemption. I suspect these are phrases that we all hope would be held by everyone. Nonviolence resistance does not seek to defeat or humiliate the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. Let no man pull you so low as to hate him. Means must be as pure as the end. And the day of peace will be the day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man. They attract us and inspire us. They are part that we remember from King. His speech, though, the full speech, struck that precarious balance between insistence and reassurance, his conservative militancy and his radical moderation. King knew that he had a role to fill as a bridge between many communities. He said it directly in 1966. "My role, perhaps, is to interpret to the white world. There must be somebody to communicate to two worlds." In 1964, a year before the Voting Rights Act was passed, a New York Times poll found a majority of people said the civil rights movement had gone too far and was moving too fast. Some spoke of Negroes receiving everything on a silver platter and reverse discrimination. By 1966, the Gallup poll found only 32% of people having a positive rating of Dr. King. You can see the change from 63 to 66. 63% unfavorable. By 1968, 72% of white Americans had an unfavorable rating of Dr. King. How can this be? How can the man that we universally identify as, I will argue, the greatest non-elected person ever in American history, and I might argue the greatest American, be seen so unfavorably? Let's go back to the first 10 minutes of the Dreene speech. He opens, once he does his details, he opens by referencing the Emancipation Proclamation. 50 years ago came as a joyous daybreak to end captivity. 100 years later, he said, the Negro is still not free. The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. The Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the middle of a vast ocean of material prosperity, finds himself in exile in his own land. We've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. He demands that we come to cash a check. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation of the Declaration, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. He lays out economic realities, and his audience understood everything that he said. But then in that same 10 minutes, he pivots. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt, that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity in this nation. Dang, he's good. He describes the first fierce urgency of now. The sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. He's telling the nation, you can't wait. Then he gets on to the final question. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? A query still asked by people of privilege today of the marginalized. King's reply, we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. As long as our bodies, heavy with fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging. As long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. As long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity. The dropped idea of creative dissatisfaction was central to King's thinking. 4 months later, he said this, we all want the well-adjusted life, but there are certain things in our nation and the world which I am proud to be maladjusted to, and in which I hope all men of goodwill will be maladjusted to. I say very honestly that I never intend to become adjusted to segregation and discrimination, to become adjusted to religious bigotry, to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. I never intend to adjust myself to the madness of militarism, to self-defeating effects of physical violence. And he called us to be committed to creative maladjustment. 1963 had a second great document from Dr. King, his letter from Birmingham jail. Responding to 8 white ministers who advised him to slow down the movement, King commented that there was never a direct action campaign that was well-timed. He wrote, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost meant never. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill, when you have seen the vast majority of Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. 8 years earlier in Montgomery during the boycott, King told blacks that they need not accept white injustice. It is not enough, though, just to speak about love. Love is one of the principal parts of Christian faith. There is another called justice. This is not a war between the whites and Negroes. This is a conflict between justice and injustice. You see, King's dream, his vision was universal, not tribal, not national. He assumed and believed that whites could be redeemed. In fact, he argued at that same time that the Negro is God's instrument to save the soul of America. For King, the letter from Birmingham expressed his central belief that black dignity and self-respect. And he advised black Americans to let no force, person, or system make you feel you are inferior. It revealed his core belief about civil disobedience, aimed at achieving negotiation. That reveals his concept of the beloved community, that nonviolence has the power to transform your enemy into a friend, and only nonviolence can lead to reconciliation. And reconciliation can only occur when justice is present. King's dream is complex and went through iterations. But what Cornel West has described as the Santa Clausification of King has blocked the complete picture of his dreams. In an increasingly public manner after 1965, King, in both sorrowful and I would argue actively hopeful ways, connected what he called the triplets of misery, connections between racism, materialism, and militarism. So what happens to a dream deferred? Sadly, though understandably, King grew despondent about his dream. By 1967, he had carried the weight of 10 years leading a movement. He had carried the weight of a decade of actual threats on his body and tons more verbalized threats. He had carried the weight of being challenged within the black community. And despite trying to tell his audience after the bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church to, quote, not lose faith in our white brothers, his optimism was being tested. In August of 1965, the 11th of August, the uprising in Watts, only 5 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, entrenched a major pivot in King's beliefs. Although sparked by a single incident, as many know, about police brutality, the conditions that led to Watts started long before protesters hit the streets. And with this, we could learn something about Ferguson and Black Lives Matter. Watts was a neighborhood whose residents had long protested poor housing and sanitation, and underfunded and segregated schools, and a heavy police presence. In fact, in the 3 years leading up to the uprising, Los Angeles police officers killed at least 65 people, 27 of whom were shot in the back, 25 of which were unarmed. The Watts uprising left 34 dead and 4,000 arrested. King went to Watts, but before a crowd was told, "Get out of here, Dr. King, we don't want you." One person mocked him. "I have a dream, I have a dream. Hell, we don't need no damn dreams, we want jobs." His close friend Bayard Rustin told him, "There are literally two Americas, one beautifully rich and white, and one ugly, poor, and mostly black." King began to invert his refrain. In 1965, he told an audience in Chicago, "I've had to watch my dream transformed into a nightmare." Yet he still retained hope, as in that same speech, he concluded it with, "I still have a dream," because if you lose hope, somehow you lose that vitality and courage that keeps you going. And so today, I still have a dream. In 1967, in this interview with Sander Vanacore, King acknowledged a soul-searching, agonizing moments he had had since that famous speech. And he said to Vanacore, "The old optimism of the civil rights movement was a little superficial and needed to be tempered with solid realism," as he spoke about the difficult days ahead. A few months later, he voiced similar sentiments in his Christmas sermon on peace, December the 24th, 1967. "We have neither peace within nor peace without. Everywhere, paralyzing fears harrow people day and haunt them by night. Our world is sick with war everywhere we turn." He feared that people will destroy ourselves by the misuse of our own instruments, our own power. Now let me suggest first that if we are to have peace on earth, our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. We must transcend race, tribe, class, nation, and develop a world perspective. He then turns back to August of 1963. "I tried to talk to the nation about a dream, that I had had. And I must confess to you today that not long after talking about that dream, I started seeing it turn into a nightmare. And he went back and described how the 16th Street church bombing affected him. And then he talked about the Watts and the ghetto uprisings, which were lonely islands of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. And there was understandable outrage into misguided riots. Then that dream turned into a nightmare as I watched the war in Vietnam escalate. King spent long periods in isolation in 1967 to write what ended up being his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. In the book, as well as a speech he gave that year, he presents a challenge within the vision of hope and a call to action. And he asserts that we still have a long, long way to go before we reach the promised land. The daily life of the Negro is still lived in the basement of the Great Society. Of the good things in life, the Negro has approximately one-half those of whites. Of the bad things, he has twice those of whites. But freedom is not won passively accepting suffering. Freedom is won by struggle against suffering. Negroes have not yet paid the full price of freedom, and whites have not yet faced the full cost of justice. While recognizing the challenge of convincing a people who for centuries that they were told they are nobodies is not easy, he declared we must massively assert our dignity and worth and no longer be ashamed of being black. And then he went to assess the rising movement called Black Power. There is nothing essentially wrong, he said, about power. The problem is that in America, power is unequally distributed. He praised elements of Black Power as a call to the pooling of black financial resources to achieve economic security and a psychological call to manhood. What is needed is the realization that power without love is reckless and abusive. In his final analysis, he says, the weakness of black power is its failure to see that the black man needs the white man and the white man needs the black man. We are bound together in a single garment of destiny. Again, I reference our current zero-sum tribal mentality, and we need to rethink King's words. Seeking justice, he told his audience, brotherhood and truth can never advocate violence. For through violence, you may murder a murderer, but you can't murder murder. Through violence, you may murder a liar, but you can't establish truth. And then those wonderful words, darkness cannot put out darkness. Only light can do that. But he went on to criticize moderate whites. Because once blacks started to demand equal economic opportunity, King wrote, while whites want justice, they delude themselves in a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. That fair play now exists. He went on to argue, the best way to end poverty is to guarantee an income to everybody. King emphasizes that he is not a Marxist nor a doctrinal socialist. Marx ignores the spirit in communism, reducing men to a cog in the wheel of the state, and forgets that life is individual. Yet as King said in a 1953 sermon, though incompatible with Christianity, communism contains many essential truths that must forever challenge us as Christians. And capitalism leaves a gulf between superfluous wealth and abject poverty, encourages a cutthroat competition and selfish ambition, and forgets that life is social. There are those who said that King advocated communism. He argued that the kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both. He references a parable from Jesus about Nicodemus, who asked Jesus, "What do I do to be saved?" King summarized Christ's instructions to Nicodemus as thus, "Your whole structure must be changed, and you must be born again." And then he said, that is what America must do. King returned to the idea he dropped from his August 28th speech, that of creative destruction. Let us be dissatisfied until America will no longer have a high blood pressure of creeds and anemia of deeds. Let us be dissatisfied until the tragic walls that separate the outer city of wealth and comfort from the inner city of poverty and despair shall be crushed by the forces of justice. Until slums are cast in the junk heaps of history and every family will have live in a decent sanitary home. until integration is not seen as a problem, but as an opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. Until that day when nobody will shout white power, nobody will shout black power, but everyone will talk about God's power and human power. Let us realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. A true revolution of values, he said, will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. A genuine revolution of values means in the final analysis that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Giving depth to this more outspoken vision, King gave this profound sermon. The Drum Major Instinct, February 4th, 1968. The Drum Major Instinct is taken from Mark chapter 10. And in this description, if you don't know it, apostles James and John desire recognition and glory. And then Christ gives the advice that the greatest role is that of servant. King reminds his audience, and you and me, to recognize that the desire for recognition is universal in mankind. We all want to be important, to achieve distinction, even to lead. We like to do something good, and we like to be praised for it. This warm glow we feel when we are praised is the vitamin A to our ego. But there comes a time that the drum major instinct can become destructive. If the instinct is not harnessed, it becomes a very dangerous, pernicious instinct. For instance, if it isn't harnessed, it causes one's personality to become distorted. It causes you to lie about who you know sometimes and engage in activities that are merely used to get attention. It can lead to trying to push other people down in order to push oneself up. It leads to snobbish exclusivism. And King said that nations are caught up in this too. I must be first. I must be supreme. Our nation must rule the world. And then he issued a powerful and perhaps uncomfortable criticism of America. God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now. God didn't call America to engage in a senseless, unjust war. And we are criminals in that war. We've committed more war crimes almost than any nation in the world. And it won't stop because of our pride and our arrogance as a nation. But God has a way of even putting nations in their place. 7 weeks later, in his final formal speech, remaining awake through a great revolution, given at the National Cathedral, that beautiful place in Washington, King gives this speech. Now he comes to this, remember the approval ratings in 1968. Not even a third of people had a positive approval rating of him. Papers in Memphis, which I'll get to in a little bit, called him Chicken a la King for leaving Memphis. The St. Louis Globe-Democrat called him one of the most menacing men in America today. He came to this congregation asking its members to be alive and awake to the great revolutions in progress. Still addressed racial justice, the black man's burden and the white man's shame. Racism is a way of living, he said, for whites. Spoken and unspoken, acknowledged and denied, subtle and sometimes not so subtle. Everyone, individuals and institutions, and he cited the church itself, is responsible for this. And he said, time will not heal this. Human progress never rolls on the wheels of inevitability. And then he addresses another myth, the over-reliance on the bootstrap philosophy. There are those who still feel that if the Negro is to rise, he must do it all by himself, lift himself by his own bootstraps. He argued that freedom from slavery was not enough, and that it was ironic to deny freedmen compensation, while, as he said, at the same time, Congress gave away millions of acres of land in the West and in the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe. This was an intentional effort to attract European migrants to the Midwest with an economic floor. It built land-grant colleges and provided agents to teach them how to farm. It provided low interest rates so that they could mechanize their farms. To this day, thousands of those farmers receive millions of dollars in subsidies every year. And these are so often the very people who tell Negroes that they must lift themselves by their own bootstraps. It is cruel, he said, to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. King shifted to poverty as a whole and its invisible nature in America. It's invisible because those great corridors of highways take us from suburbs to work without seeing the urban core, without seeing Appalachia. And then he gets to my very favorite part of this sermon. He cites the parable of Dives. Lazarus was a lame beggar who once remained unnoticed outside the nice doors of Dives, a very wealthy man's home. They both died. Dives looked up from hell to heaven to see Lazarus in the bosom of Abraham. The parable then goes on to present the conversation between Dives and Abraham. Dives asks Abraham, "Send Lazarus," still treating him as a servant, "to come down to dip his finger in a cup of water so that he can just parch my burning lips." The conversation goes back and forth, and Abraham denies this request. According to King and others, this parable is not a condemnation of wealth. Abraham was far wealthier than Dives. Dives didn't go to hell because he was rich. Dives didn't realize that his wealth was his opportunity to bridge the gulf that separated him from his brother Lazarus. Dives went to hell because he passed by Lazarus every day, and he never really saw him. He went to hell because he allowed his brother to become invisible. Dives went to hell because he maximized the minimum and minimized the maximum. Dives indeed went to hell because he sought to be a conscientious objector in the war against poverty. King continued on to announce his last campaign, known as Resurrection City. "We will go to D.C. to ask America to be true to the promissory note signed years ago, to make the invisible visible. Ultimately, a great nation is a compassionate nation. America has not met its obligations and its responsibilities to the poor. It seems that I can hear the God of history saying, 'I was hungry, and you fed me not. I was naked, and you clothed me not. Consequently, you cannot enter the kingdom of greatness. If ye do not do unto the least of these, my brethren, ye do it unto me.'" That's the question facing America today, he said. He continued arguing that he was convinced that our war in Vietnam was one of the most unjust wars that had ever been fought in the history of the world, and it damaged our ability to meet domestic needs. "The judgment of God is upon us today," he said. "We have alienated ourselves from our nation, other nations, so we end up morally and politically isolated in the world." King had declared that the judgment of God was on America before. For him, violence is derived from hate, and hate contradicts God. Having received the Nobel Peace Prize, pushed King, as he said, "It was a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man, to understand that I can't just stick with national allegiances." In 1967, as he prepared to give his most cited statement against the war at Riverside Church in New York, for the first time in a decade, King was not listed on the Gallup poll's top 10 most respected people in America. At Riverside, he told a 3,000-person overflow audience, "A time comes when silence is betrayal. My conscience leaves me no other choice than to break the betrayal of my own silences over the past 2 years." And I've always thought that King was too hard on himself because he had been speaking out against war his whole life. He did so in 1949, citing our material and intellectual advances outrunning our moral progress. In 1953, he wrote a sermon called "The False God of Nationalism." Sorry, let me get to this. Yeah. The watchword of this new religion is "My country, right or wrong." It was preached by Hitler, by Mussolini, and America by the McCarthys and the advocators of white supremacy and the America First movements. In early '65, King called for negotiated settlement in Vietnam, telling journalists, "I'm much more than a civil rights leader." His criticism received pushback from Senator Tom Dodd of Connecticut, a close friend of Johnson. Johnson and Dodd approached King, and King agreed to, quote, temporarily stop speaking out against the war. In 1966, he began to quietly do so, privately expressing concerns. By early '67, he seemed to have had enough. He wrote, in Journey of Conscience, I now stood naked with some shame and guilt, as indeed every German should have. I had for too long allowed myself to be a silent onlooker. And in February, he described the war as a new form of colonialism. Some reporters began to call him out of his league, and others said he was a traitor. Dr. King told Stanley Levison, a close ally, he could no longer be cautious. I had to raise my voice against what he called the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. That picture is Dr. King with Dr. Spock at an anti-war rally. Levison arranged the speech and sermon at Riverside. In that commentary, he said, "We have no honorable intentions in Vietnam and have been wrong from the beginning. We have tested weapons on civilians, just as the Germans tested out medicines and new tortures in the concentration camps of Europe. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam." He encouraged young men to avoid the draft as conscientious objectors, and he encouraged the U.S. to pay reparations to Vietnam. For King, the war was more than a war. It was a symptom of a larger malady in America in which profit motives and property took over more importance than people and ideals. The Riverside crowd gave him an absolute standing ovation, but the editorial denunciations were swift and harsh. The Washington Post and New York Times criticized his sheer inventions of unsupported fantasy, called his comments facile and slander, said he was wrong to divert attention from the civil rights movement. Life magazine branded his speech demagogic slander, a script for Radio Hanoi. Even some of the black press criticized him. The Pittsburgh Courier warned that King was tragically misleading African Americans. The NAACP distanced itself from him and said, "We are a civil rights organization." On April 4th, 1968, the day that he was murdered, the last day of his life, King phoned in his sermon for Sunday to Ebenezer Baptist, his home church. The title of that sermon, "Why America May Go to Hell." According to Cornel West, it's no accident that just prior to King's death, 72% of whites and 55% of blacks disapproved of his opposition to the Vietnam War and eradication of poverty. Even black leaders shunned King. But King, in West's words, chose unarmed truth and unconditional love. He refused to be enticed by avenues of power. "I'd rather be dead than be afraid," he said. Let us further examine his vision of social and economic justice. After a couple of decades resisting a holiday to Dr. King, a number of conservative politicians and pundits began to appropriate King and his content of his character line to marshal opposition to affirmative action. In June of 1985, President Reagan cited King's line to oppose affirmative action, claiming that King's vision of a colorblind society would not include racial hiring quotas. On January the 15th, 1986, the day before the first Martin Luther King holiday, Attorney General Edwin Meese proposed to eliminate minority hiring goals for federal contractors, claiming that this proposal was very consistent with what Dr. King had in mind. The 1990 book by Shelby Steele, The Content of Our Character, offers a far more nuanced assessment and rejection of affirmative action. More recently, in 2013, conservative historian Peter Schramm claimed that King was, quote, against all policies based on race. King's allies were befuddled by all this. They say the public record is clear. King openly supported such policies. Let's look at his record. In Why We Can't Wait, King wrote, "Whenever the issue of compensatory treatment for the Negro is raised, some of her friends recoil in horror. The Negro should be granted equality, they agree, but he should ask for nothing more." And where do we go from here? He asked, "A society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must do now something special for him now. The practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap." King argued that justice requires affirmative action and called for government investment in education, in housing, and employment programs in black communities. His SCLC created such a program in Operation Breadbasket that called for companies to hire certain numbers of blacks. He argued that as a nation, we had given preferential treatment to returning veterans from World War II. It should do the same for blacks in the realm of jobs and education. King's speechwriter, Clarence Jones, and legal advisor, said that King's position on affirmative action was evolving to support policies that helped all poor people, not one particular race. The last 2 years of his life, he had targeted that topic. We came to the conclusion that the economic circumstances of poor people transcended the issues of color and race. In a 1965 interview with Alex Haley, Haley posed the question, do you feel it's fair to request a multi-billion-dollar program of preferential treatment for the Negro? King replied, I do indeed. Can any fair-minded citizen deny that the Negro has been deprived? It is an economic fact that a program such as I propose would certainly cost far less than any computation of 2 centuries of unpaid wages plus accumulated interest. In any case, I do not intend that this program of economic aid should apply only to the Negro. It should benefit the disadvantage of all races. Perhaps more contentious is King's democratic socialism. This slide is a 1957 image that was created about King at a communist training school. That training school I mentioned last talk, it's the Highlander School. This billet is a claim that he was a communist. Here you have a survey from the 1964 Gallup poll. Almost a majority would believe that communism was influencing the movement. As the 60s wore on, King was increasingly viewing American politics through the lens of class. His advisors, Levison and Bayard Rustin, had once been part of the Communist Party. And class became his focus. Thomas Jackson, in a book he wrote in 2007, described King's vision of this as a form of socialism of the heart. In a speech to his staff in 1966, King explained, something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. King at multiple times affirmed the right of unions, claiming that the labor movement was the principal force that transformed misery and despair into hope and progress. It's the reason that we got unemployment insurance, old age pensions, government relief for the destitute, and above all, new wage levels that meant not mere survival, but a tolerable life. It was the pioneer anti-poverty program, he said. In 1966, he asserted a right to health care, stating that all the forms of inequality, injustice in health care is the most shocking and most inhumane. He called for an economic Bill of Rights that would grant a job to anyone who wanted to work and a guaranteed income to anyone who could not work. King's final campaigns that focused on the Poor People's Campaign happened against the advice of his advisors as he took his movement north. The Northerners like to absolve ourselves from the race question and problem. We understand that it exists in the North, and we understand that why de jure segregation may not have existed everywhere, de facto did, and private actions limited black access to equal opportunity. Political decisions benefited the suburbs, harmed the urban core. King understood going north was a risk. It would endanger his support from labor unions, from Catholic and Protestant whites, from moderate Republicans, but he believed it was an essential undertaking. King decided that Chicago would be the focus of this. At Chicago, it was James Bevel and Albert Raby that convinced him to come to Chicago. It had a sizable black population. It had a small coalition willing to welcome him, unlike New York and Philadelphia, in which some black leaders said, don't come here. And it had Mayor Richard Daley, who controlled the whole city. So their argument was, if you turn Daley, convince him, the city will follow. Change Chicago, and the rest of the country will go along. We've got to go for broke, Bevel told King. After the Watts riot, King didn't need much convincing. Chicago would be the springboard. So he began to organize the Chicago Freedom Movement and later the Poor People's Campaign. And he told his followers, you can't really get close to the poor without living and being here with them. So he had advisors find him an apartment. And on the morning of January the 26th, 1966, King moved his family into a common tenement apartment in one of Chicago's ghetto neighborhoods, 2 blocks away from the headquarters of the Vice Lords, one of the most vicious gangs in the city. In her memoir, Coretta Scott King recalled that our apartment was on the 3rd floor of a dingy building, which had no lights in the hall, only one dim bulb at the head of the stairs. As we walked in, the smell of urine was overpowering. We were told that this was because the door was always open and the drunks came in off the street to use the hallway as a toilet. That summer, King first walked the community to get a lay of the land, and then he would lead protests throughout Chicago's black and white working class neighborhoods. Some African Americans in the North were not in sync with King. Some told him, "We don't want you here." Ministers, if they backed the mayor, they got like $1 leases on land to expand their facilities. If they didn't back the mayor, they had tickets on their cars and stuff like this. White folks who may a year earlier have applauded the movement started to act differently now. Complaints included, "This is not civil rights. This movement north takes away persons' rights. I built a home for myself. I would hate to think of being forced to sell my lovely home to anyone just because they had money." Upset with the end of restrictive covenants. Protesters threw rocks, beat people with clubs and fists, and yelled ugly comments of white power, Polish power, burn them like the Jews. Roses are reds, violets are black. King would look good with a knife in his back. One protester tried to do that, missed King and hit another protester. At one point, King was hit in the head with part of a brick. Collapsed, sank to one knee, dazed for a bit. The crowd's yelling, "Kill him, kill him." He rose and marched on. He told reporters, "I've been hit so many times, I'm immune to it. I have to do this," he said. "I have to expose myself to bring this hate into the open." And then he said, "I think that people from Mississippi ought to come to Chicago to learn how to hate." After 7 months of action, Mayor Daley signed an agreement, agreement with King. Daley vowed to take steps to stop discrimination if King would leave the city. King did. A year later, Daley had done nothing that he had promised. King declared their agreement, quote, "a sham and a batch of false promises." In all frankness, he said, "We found the job greater than we even imagined." And the movement generally went down as one of the least successful chapters of the movement for civil rights. But not unsuccessful. The Chicago Freedom Movement is widely credited for inspiring the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which finally protected the rights of black folks and other minorities to rent and purchase homes where they had the resources to do so. After leaving Chicago, King renewed his planning of the Poor People's Campaign in Resurrection City. Operation Breadbasket, which I mentioned, was central to this. It was in a number of cities, but it was centered in Chicago and Cleveland. And it entailed some nice, successful efforts, not systematic, but nice examples of it. Rehabilitating buildings, $4 million that rebuilt deteriorated buildings so they could own homes. Brought 2,200 new jobs to Chicago for black folks. It developed black-owned financial institutions, and it worked with various chain stores to help blacks get jobs that white, say, garbage workers were taking instead. In housing in Atlanta, built 152 new homes for the residents there. In doing all of this, King believed that the centerpiece of the Poor People's Campaign would be seen in Memphis, Tennessee. The struggle of garbage workers in Memphis would expose the need for economic equality and social justice that he hoped his Poor People's Campaign would highlight nationally. Sanitation workers, their wages were so low, about $1 an hour, that many were on welfare and many relied on food stamps. While truck crews were often 4 men, only 2 could fit in the driver's cab, in the car's cab. That left other crew members to either walk alongside the moving truck or hold on to its edges. They had to carry these 55 empty 55-gallon drugs up and down containers, etc. At the time, they didn't use plastic bags, so these were filled and they would leak out onto their clothing. The tubs, heavy, the sanitation workers, filthy, received only one city-issued uniform. And there were no facilities left by the city to clean up after work. When they took lunch breaks, they weren't allowed to sit in neighborhoods because they were intimidating to the people. They had tried to strike in 1966, but didn't get the support of the religious leaders of the city. Conditions for them worsened when Mayor Loeb became mayor in January of '68. And then tragedy struck. On February the 1st, 1968, two Memphis garbage workers, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, were seeking refuge from rain, and they were trying to take a nap inside the crushing container of the truck. And it malfunctioned and crushed them to death. That moment was equivalent to the Emmett Till moment. It had gone too far. Add to it that Walker's widow was pregnant at the time and was told that the city provided no survivor benefits to unclassified workers such as her husband. Mayor Loeb allocated a one-time $500 payment to her. That same day, in a separate incident about inclement weather, 22 black workers were sent home without pay, while white workers were kept to do nothing but be paid. Workers went on strike. In just 2 days, an estimated 10,000 tons of garbage piled up. Discussions between the mayor and the union broke down. After many efforts to strike, the city council offered a compromise. The mayor rejected that. And I'm sorry I had it out of order, but Dr. King was brought in. James Lawson, his friend, had been in the strike for a number of days. King comes in and gives a brief speech and then had to go home and plan another event. King is scheduled to come back for a march on April the 28th. Bad weather canceled that march. So he would be back for a planned march on April the 5th. King got despondent because during one of these marches, violence broke out. Some black workers and some white protesters were throwing things. Lawson and King both were grappling with the idea that these devotees, Lawson and King of nonviolence, were not able to control this group. That's why King wanted to come back. His advisor said, skip Memphis, go back to Chicago. King felt the Poor People's Campaign is Memphis. He was in Memphis to save his values and his identity. Despondent and defiant, he returned. He worked with actually a black power group called the Invaders to set up the march for April the 5th. He arrived and gave on the night of the 3rd that speech that you've heard, the mountaintop speech. And then you know that at about dinner time, 6:01, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, he was assassinated. Over 120 cities across the nation erupted in violence and outrage. Pittsburgh was one of them. The Post-Gazette featured a nice full-page study of this a few days ago. The mayor continued to resist the sanitation workers. On April the 8th, an estimated 42,000 people, led by Coretta Scott King, the SCLC, and union leaders, silently marched through Memphis to honor Dr. King. Eventually, the strike was settled, but it took, as one worker said, a crucifixion for it to be settled. That last campaign of his that he had planned, Resurrection City, went on. On May the 11th, a little over a month after his death, a settlement of tents and shacks were built on the mall to house protesters meant to draw attention to the fight to end hunger and poverty in America. Thousands of people came. Estimates are that at any time, 3,000 to 6,000 were camped out in this shanty town. African Americans, American Indians, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, poor whites. They built their own tents. They had lessons teaching about Head Start, and other programs. They were making explicit what he had said in many of his speeches. His beloved community went far beyond race. Disinherited people all over the world are bleeding, he had said, from deep social and economic wounds. The legacy of the program, in which you see, in many ways, Ralph Abernathy nailing the wood together here. Eunice Shriver helping to build shanty town tents. The rain came, flooded it out in an ugly way. The legacy of the 6-week effort is mixed. Some say it did nothing. Others suggest, though, that President Nixon was inspired because he had helped sign into law food stamp program and WIC. And certainly one of the proponents of this and the planners, Marian Wright Edelman, and her eventual creation of the Children's Defense Fund were inspired by this. But in closing, I'd like to wrap up with a few sets of questions here. And I'll go through what I want to ask you to think about for our question and answer session. Is King relevant, or is he merely an historical oddity? Was there a wrong king? Where do we go from here? Let me spend about 5 minutes giving you my questions to you. Do we still believe in the beloved community? Do we believe like our founders did, Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and King? Do we believe in a creedal nation rather than a tribal one? Tamar Jacoby in 1998 wrote this: "If integration is still most Americans' ideal of the goal, few of us talk about it anymore. 3/4 of white Americans have no close non-white friends. The average white person's 100 closest friends, you will find that 91 would be white. If you looked at the average person's 100 closest friends, 83 of them would be black. Do we believe it's possible? Or do we believe that Richard Spencer and David Duke and white separatism are right? Do we believe in nonviolence? King had even asked after Selma. 100 political commentators have interred nonviolence into a premature grave. Americans in the 21st century have cheered death and destruction in the war on terror and have accepted at the highest level and encouraged even the violation of human rights in the euphemism called enhanced interrogation. Do we believe in civic activism and being our brother's keeper? Or do we accept a radically privatized vision of liberty? Do we believe in one man, one vote? Or after the Shelby versus Holder decision, have we abandoned that? Indeed, do we still believe in the beloved community? Do we believe in the concept of service? The drum major instinct ends this way. I want you to see what Jesus was really saying. He said, you want to be significant. Well, you ought to be. If you're going to be my disciple, you must be. But Jesus reordered priorities and said, you don't give up that instinct. It's a good instinct if you use it right. It's a good instinct if you don't distort it and pervert it. Keep feeling the need for being first, but I want you to be first in love. I want you to be first in moral excellence. I want you to be first in generosity. And King said, Jesus gave us a new form of greatness, to serve. And then he asked, and he reflected on his death. And he said, I don't want a long funeral. If there is a eulogy, please tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize, or 300 other awards, or where I went to school. That isn't important. But I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others, tried to love somebody, tried to be right on the war question, tried to feed the hungry, tried to clothe those who were naked, tried to visit those who were in prison, tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice, for peace, for righteousness, and all the other things, they don't matter. In his mountaintop speech, that last comment he gave, he referenced the story of Jericho and the desire to serve whomever. He asked us then to develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. He asked us to remember America as it ought to be. So will we serve others or continue to sort ourselves into like-minded communities? Do we like the radical king? Are we willing to creatively maladjust? His comments on war and militarism. In my mind, the very most astute analyst of foreign policy is Andrew Bacevich. He is a Vietnam veteran, served in the State Department, and is currently a professor at Boston University. He would concur with King's analysis. Bacevich wrote famously in a book assessing Operation Mongoose, the covert operation to undermine Castro in 61 and 62, calling it, quote, state-sponsored terrorism. What would King say about our term collateral damage or the use of drone warfare? What about economic inequality? The Kerner Report was issued on February the 29th, 1968. The gentleman here is the only living member of the committee that wrote it. It studied our nation's civil disturbances in urban America, and its most famous or infamous line is that our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Tragic, 14 years after Earl Warren had written that separate is inherently unequal, the Kerner Commission concluded that we are worse than we were. It laid the primary blame down at the feet of white racism. King had said in a March 14th speech called The Other America, "It is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without at the same time condemning the intolerable conditions that exist in our society. I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard." He described strangulation in the air. The Kerner Commission analyzed it and gave us a set of principles that we could overcome the conditions that exist. But today, that gentleman wrote a book that came out a month ago, Healing Our Divided Nation. Fred Harris finds we are going the wrong way. Over here, 1989 is when school integration peaked. We are less integrated 30 years later than we were in 1989. Over here, you can see the distribution around. He put this in a New York Times column he wrote, where you can see median household income. A lot of things go up for black folks. It's really good. High school graduation rates are much better. But we're finding that even wealthy black folks do not meet the success levels of wealthy white folks, still finding limits there. Harris's analysis is that the lack of commitment to the Great Society in the late 70s and 80s was the cause for the stalling of this success. He compared Jimmy Carter and George W. Bush's analysis of Ferguson uprising with what they had compared in the Kerner Commission. Doesn't seem like much difference after 50 years. We then ask, even within, say, the area of Pittsburgh, and the dilemma with I read about in the paper a few days ago about Connect Card. I was telling my students about this. If you have the resources to have this card, your fare on the trolley is $2.50. If you have to pay cash, it's $2.75. Do we think about the implications of policies that, on one hand, seem good, but may not be? Do we believe the government is still the custodian of freedom? The Department of Justice and Education has withdrawn much of their civil rights enforcements. The Department of Housing and Urban Development under Ben Carson has just rewritten its mission statement, removing this phrase, free from discrimination. In the issue of police brutality, what say we about Stephon Clark in Sacramento or Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, or what has been now called Testalying? What say we about Black Lives Matter or Colin Kaepernick? Ultimately, King would not allow indifference to be the last word. And so, I want to again thank you for giving me the honor of feebly attempting to honor this man, and for your attention to my thoughts. And I would like to go to a set of questions and answers now. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.